Here at SIPA, we've been busily reimagining our school to deliver even more impact and innovation. This is crucial as we tackle the complex challenges we face in today's interconnected global society. And of course, I approach this from an academic angle because my background is a political scientist. But this really gives me a deep appreciation for how research, cutting-edge research, like what CGEP and its experts produce, can change minds and change the way policymakers assess information, how they make decisions about those important topics.
Through this past decade of change and upheaval, as you heard from Karen, I'm really proud that the Center on Global Energy Policy has become a trusted source of guidance for leaders who are working to untangle the many challenges facing the global energy system. And this expertise is only going to be more needed in the decade ahead. As we dive into our second decade, the Center on Global Energy Policy remains as committed as ever to helping decision makers navigate the turbulent waters of energy, geopolitics, climate, and the global economy, and helping educate the next generation of leaders, core to our mission here at a university, helping them prepare to be able to deal with these same challenges.
When I published the new map, some of the reviewers said, "Why are you writing about geopolitics in a book about energy? What does that have to do with energy?" And the question, as I think we've learned over the last year, it has to do quite a lot with energy. So I'm very pleased that we have this opportunity to have this discussion about geopolitics and how it ties into energy and the kind of dominating role it plays.
For us in Europe, the first thing that we have to highlight is that the US is back. So in a transatlantic relation, this is fundamental. And that the US is back just coming from a moment, the leaving Kabul, that was the worst moment in the image. And paradoxically, the US has won, so far, the narrative just war. And that for us is fundamental because this is what has had the repercussion of European Union being united. And the unity is a unity backed by something that Ian touched upon. Spain, for instance, we have no tradition of confrontation with, or Italy. We have no tradition of confrontation with Russia. We have of Russia a very romantic idea. But today, the polls point out that our biggest threat is Russia.
In terms of the energy impact, it has changed all of our conversations around this. We know how the war in Ukraine has influenced the conversation about climate security. I think it still remains to be proven, but there's good reason to hope that we'll look back and say that this war helped expedite at least the European and American move away from carbon-intensive energies.
There is a meaningful floor on the US-China relationship. That floor is being tested, and it comes from two different things. First, the reality of significant economic interdependence that is not going away between the US and China. US-China trade relations are at their highest. They're record levels right now. You wouldn't know that from reading the headlines. That's number one.
Nor would you know that from many of the speeches that are being
Right.
given.
And number two is the fact that outside of the United States, that there is no country that wants to have the kind of decoupling that American congressmen, Democrat and Republican, are talking about on a daily basis.
We hope that this Inflation Reduction Act will create a virtuous cycle, a race to the top, if you will, and we have seen that in Europe. In Europe, they have, and this is what we've said to Europe, put your own incentives on the table, where there's enough to go around. I mean, Bloomberg had said that this is going to be a $23 trillion sector, this clean energy sector, and the products that are in it by 2030. Believe me, there is enough room to go around. Same thing with Canada, also adopted incentives to be able to attract manufacturing. So that's great. Let's all do this because we have a huge job ahead to get to our goals from the Paris Agreement.
The Biden administration has a goal of getting to net zero before 2050. Other goals sooner of reaching emissions cuts of 50 to 52% below 2005 levels by 2030. And globally, the world has committed to trying to keep global temperatures from blowing past 1.5 degrees Celsius. We're already at 1.1.
And I think a big progress, of course, since these 7 years. Now, I think every government, every company, every local authority have been interpreting, understanding what does it mean and how to do it, because of course that's the main question. And there I see, of course, and there is a lot of pushback on many fronts, but I see now this notion that it's not an incremental change we have to make, but a very deep one, and that really reducing emission to net zero by 2050 implies a full change in many, many sectors. The good thing we are seeing is that on a number of sectors, we see the advancement. Again, when I was in the 12th December of Paris, I would not have imagined the rapid transformation of the transport sector. It was not there. The electrification of vehicles, of trucks, of many things was not there. Even now, we are even thinking about the net zero aviation, which was again unthinkable at that time because people didn't see the target. Now that there's a target, you have to say how we fulfill the commitment. And that creates enormous innovation and discussion in the system.
Really important to underscore, the Inflation Reduction Act is by far the single most significant policy that the United States has taken on climate ever. And arguably, if not the most significant, one of the most significant ever taken by any country around the world. And yet it's still not enough, right? So if we think about where we were a couple years ago, I'm going to throw out a few numbers here, which I know you'll like. 30% below 2005 levels was where US emissions were. The president, as Lisa mentioned, made a goal of going to 50 to 52% by 2030. This bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, gets us from 30%, projections say to 40%. A big step, but still far from 50 to 52% by 2030, and still quite a further to go to get to net zero.
More greenhouse gas emissions in this country during the last decade and a half than anybody would have ever guessed possible. We've far exceeded other countries. How have we done that? Well, we've done that with a fossil fuel, natural gas. Think for a minute, our natural gas is about 40% cleaner than Russia. Why aren't we replacing Russian natural gas with US natural gas? Why are we demonizing the fossil fuel industry who's talking about carbon sequestration and direct air capture? They may beat everybody else to net zero, by the way. And so I think it's really important. We have to make a decision. Do we hate fossil fuels or do we hate emissions? And I think we hate emissions.
Yeah.
I think, there could be a role for carbon capture, sequestration. There's a lot of science to be worked out. There's a lot of economics to be worked out there. But the International Energy Agency in Paris, which is the definitive source, says there's no way to get to net zero without a dramatic decline in the use of fossil fuels. On the methane question, we simply don't have the data yet globally that we need to have. Most all of the major oil companies, thankfully, have signed up for OGMP, the UN program, which provides for actual empirical measurements and third-party verification. For reasons that I don't understand, Exxon and Chevron, two American companies, are not yet willing to sign up and give the world the data that virtually all the other majors have agreed to.
On one hand, it's huge opportunities. On the other, these challenges, which in the end also translate into opportunities, especially not only for Africans, but also for others who want to invest on the continent. So after the pandemic, COVID, and then with the crisis going on in Ukraine, we are beginning to see good progress once again. Countries are turning the corner and recovering. The economies are recovering. Rwanda's, we have recovered from the crisis of COVID. Still, a few problems originating from the crisis in Ukraine.
When we talk about the trade-offs between energy access, energy development, and the energy energy transition, the introduction of renewable, clean, decarbonized energy. What does that conversation look like in Africa today? Because I know what it looks like in the US. And even in the US and Europe, I think there's an underappreciation that it is in fact a transition, that it's not linear, it's going to be bumpy.
Today. As I look at the countries that each of my colleagues here on the stage come from, I think about populations that are young and dynamic, with lots of opportunities, lots of challenges to be sure, and lots of ambition for the betterment of their societies. Thoughts that we all, I would think, should want to support.
Important to note is that having people having access to electricity and energy is not a nice to have. It is what defines a dignified life. That's what defines if you develop. That's economic growth. And it's harder depending on where in the world you are and where you're born. So myself and most people on the stage, being born Black African, even if we're lucky enough to have access, we have about 404 kilowatt hours of access right now, compared to being in the United States and living in New York and having 13,000 kilowatt hours. So it's not just about getting access to energy, it's getting access to energy that you can develop and grow. And I guess my last point that's very important is there's no scenario where we can achieve our 2050 goals if we don't achieve our 2030 goals. And sometimes people forget that, and we jump to net zero, which is truly important, or we want to get to, but we're not going to do that with so many millions of people in energy poverty.
The average African contributes every year to greenhouse gas emission, let me say carbon dioxide, 0.4 of a ton. The average American contributes 14 tons. So I think the real story of decarbonization should be here in the US, in the global north, and the real story is development in the global south. That's what we should be thinking about.
Africa. We are for transformation. We are not stuck on fossil fuels, but we're also looking at fossil fuels as a way of generating the capital that we need to invest in the renewable energies. There are opportunities, for example, arising from the Ukrainian war, where actually developed countries went into fossil fuels. At one arm, they are using their own fossil fuels. There is an opportunity for Africa to actually use that opportunity to generate the capital which can be invested. We need investment in the energy sector, and we cannot rely on external funding. We want to have internally generated funds.
Supply and demand. You've observed, and rightly so, with Václav Smil and others, that energy transitions typically happen when you have demand, ultimately. Demand-driven is how we've seen transitions throughout history. We're at a moment in time, it is argued, where we don't have time for that.
Well, what I think legislation or support from the regulator is helping to do here is to accelerate the elimination of what we call the green premium, right? So when a new technology comes to age, well, it's usually a bit more expensive than the one it replaces, simply because it's not at scale yet, and you have a number. So what the IRA and other policies across the world are helping to accelerate is to remove part of that green premium, to help removing that part. But it's still demand-led. It's not supply pushed.
Now, it is not either or. I think you've got to deploy the things that we have at scale today, and where the green premium is taken care of just by scaling, like solar and wind and other things, and electrification of transportation. But there are many others, exactly like steel and cement. If you were to decarbonize that, you have to pay a premium. So there is innovation needed to bring down the cost to reduce the premium. We have to have, as all studies have shown, if you are to keep below 2 degrees, global average temperature rise below 2 degrees, you've got to have negative emissions. And we haven't paid enough attention to energy efficiency. And I think that's, you don't want to create a whole in a, in a renewable and clean electricity infrastructure when you're wasting all that energy. So I think that those are many of the things that we have to do. So policy matters, deployment matters, but innovation is going to continue as we move into this, as we have seen many other transition in the past, in other sectors as well.
So this is why there's really a big role for government here, because the upfront cost in standing up clean technologies is massive. And I don't think it is realistic to just look at companies to carry that cost, precisely because the first mover advantage isn't so visible, isn't so palpable as it is in other sectors. And here we really, from a public policy perspective, we need to wrap our minds around it. I think the IRA in the US is one of these answers. Europe is now going the same path. But this is really something we need to wrap our minds around, because if the only difference is that the cost is higher, so this is what Bill Gates likes to call the green premium, but the product itself is not really that different, it's very difficult for me to see how we generate the necessary demand.
I think, I'm very much sure now that everybody is talking about hydrogen. There is a clear consensus in the IEA discussion that hydrogen has a future. When I was executive director of the IEA, I announced that golden age of natural gas is coming. It was 2011. And now, last year, IEA, Fatih Birol said, golden age of natural gas is closing. But he said, still the LNG, golden age of LNG is coming. I now can easily announce that golden age of hydrogen is definitely coming.
Look, this is where I'm an alarmist. I don't believe enough focus is being done on how do we, if we really want to be faithful about this idea, we need the emerging world to come along with us. We need to get the equity owners of these development banks to rethink about and reimagine the charters of these institutions. The problem is it's going to require a lot more capital for these institutions if they're going to be the junior lender, the first loss piece. If we had that mechanism, then there'd be quite a bit of private capital that would come there. But right now, whether you're investing in a country in Africa or a country in Southeast Asia that needs help, every project is like baking bread. And if you can't get to trillions of dollars of financing project by project by project by project. And so we need to be realistic about if we are really faithful to this notion that we have to bring the whole world forward together, then we have to reimagine the whole world's mechanism to finance the developing world moving forward together.
If we want to solve our climate problem without forgetting the energy security, I think we need to build a grand coalition consisting of the governments, energy companies, civil society, investors who sincerely, I underline here sincerely, believe in the fight against climate change. So it is the reason I talked with, I had a press conference with Greta, and afterwards I had a meeting with the major CEO of a major mining company. I really enjoy the civil society's push for real action on climate change, scrutiny, and it doesn't mean that I agree with everything what they are doing 100%, but we need that dynamism and push coming from there.
Where are we?
And it's a big challenge for the energy transition, the synchronization between the demand and the supply. We are very strong to focus all the efforts on the supply, and somewhere companies like us and major companies have diminished a lot. In 2023, we will invest $12 billion in hydrocarbons. We were investing 10 years ago almost $20 billion. And so because we have decided to refocus part of investment on the new energies and renewables. And I think it's a global trend. So you have a supply and the demand continue to grow.
This big green machine that we're talking about is looking like it could break down under a multitude of challenges: inflation and high interest rates, regulatory challenges, permitting delays, and supply chain problems. That sounds pretty scary.
There's some very easy principles. Yes, we have to build out renewables at the fastest speed. Yes, we will need more investments into electrical grid than we ever believed because electricity will be growing even faster. Yes, we should think on how to reuse existing energy infrastructure, and this is why gas, and there I would agree with Patrick, to a certain extent makes sense and is an important bridge. And obviously we need to do everything, really everything, to drive efficiency and saving of energy. The biggest source is really not spending the energy first, and sometimes this gets overlooked, and I think we have to be careful to say, yeah, hydrogen makes only sense if you have to do this. We are doing hydrogen projects today, and we will continue to do so, also just to get the industry built up, get the supply chain built up, get the factories set up. And we will have to accept that this is imperfection in the overall system.
Remember that renewable energy is critical infrastructure that costs billions of dollars and needs to last 20, 30, and hopefully in some cases even longer. And fact is that in these countries, many of them, not all of them, but in these countries, the political stability, economic stability, but also the affordability. And bear in mind that even in some developed Western economies, it's hard to politically accept the prices that need to be paid for renewable energy, let alone what it would take in these countries. It is an extremely hard nut to crack. I don't think we should give up ever, because what has happened with mobile telephony in Africa is nothing shy of a miracle, because nobody thought that possible. It was. But unfortunately, critical infrastructure is different than payment systems, and we need to keep working on it. But right now, my answer would be pretty close to what Larry said.
What rich countries can do with their balance sheet and with their capability of being able to pump money into the system is not something that's easy enough for other countries to pull off. And with me on the panel, we have a really interesting set of countries with people with very different experiences coming into it. And we'll try and touch on those different country experiences and what we can learn from each other in the process of accelerating the energy transition.
The real issue is execution on the ground. I think you just need a ton of equipment, you need trained people, you need transmission infrastructure, you need land. And that is not that easy to debottleneck, actually. And as much as you would like to ramp up execution capacities to multifold of where we are right now, and that's all the targets, all the studies tell us that we need to do that, but it's actually the physical execution on the ground of just putting up wind turbines and putting up solar farms. That's not to be underestimated. It's a pretty big challenge. And scaling it up, 3-4x from where we are right now, it's going to require a lot of doing.
We understand our responsibility. I mean, that's why China, now made this carbon peak and neutrality pledge, 2020, and try to. It's not easy. We need to artificially first, try to peak much earlier. Before, the original target, the original path would be 2040. And our coal consumption going to double from there. Of course, we cannot afford, and the world could not afford. So now it's before 2030. We try to pick even earlier than that, and then try to neutralize, completely neutralize at that time. Now it's already over 10 billion tons of carbon dioxide every year. When we pick, we hope to keep it lower, but it will be more than now. And to completely neutralize this in 30 years of time, if it is 12 billion tons, then it means every year 400 million tons of need to be decarbonized, and that's more than the emission volume of California. So it won't be an easy job.
And I think one of the key issues that we are facing, and Morocco as president of the United Nations Assembly for the Environment, one of the key issues that we are facing is that those climate discussions are being held in a room, the biodiversity laws are being held in a room, and pollution and environmental issues are being held in another room. And as human beings, we cannot continue to have, and I don't want to use the word silos, but as long as we don't view these issues in a very integrated way, I don't think we will be able to find and let the private sector take the risk and the financial risks to find the right solutions to address in an integrated manner the biggest challenges of this 21st century.
A year ago, we were really looking at quite a horrific outlook for Europe with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. There was conversations about a potential even deindustrialization of Europe because of a major energy crisis. In terms of oil prices, people were forecasting potentially $200 a barrel oil on the back of sanctions. And yet, fast forward a year, we look at where natural gas prices are, we look at Europe's ability to build inventory. Oil prices are not in the 30s, they're in the 80s, but they are off the highs that we saw in March. And so as we think about energy security, where are we?
From an energy security point of view, we're still worried, and I'm still extremely worried about the lack of spare capacity that we see around the world. And that's the result of the massive underinvestment that's happened over the past 7 years. So we're not there yet, and we're seeing also new investments in production capacity really just being made in the core OPEC GCC countries.
Yeah, I think
the fundamentals are telling you should invest. Right. But the business model to invest that much money in infrastructure at the moment doesn't exist. So if you look at all the things you need to do simply beyond the upstream investments that are required, if you need the liquefaction facilities, the ships, the receiving facilities, the ability of building pipelines from wherever the supply is to the coastal areas to put it on the water, or if you need to do very long pipelines, all these investments are infrastructure investments that, generally speaking, the actors in the business don't like doing. This is not their strong point. They like to drill wells and produce well. And they are sometimes in the downstream and they like their refineries. But they don't like the infrastructure investment. And so they're not inclined by nature to do so. And the companies that do so today don't have the means to do it. The utilities on a global basis don't have the ability to build it. So at the moment we're looking, I mean, I was talking about it earlier, said, I've heard all day today, we are going to invest in this, and we are going to invest in that, and we are going to do this. Would somebody please tell me who we is?
And I am fully on board with President Biden's goals and his ambitions around what our emission reduction should be in the United States. So there's a lot of common ground here. And the enthusiasm that Secretary Granholm brings to new technologies, that's what it's going to take for us to achieve the goals that we need to achieve as a country. So having those, the commitment to technologies, leveraging her department, enhancing her staff, and getting it structured so that we could implement the benefits of the IRA bill is critically important, because otherwise we would be very, very much slowed down. So she understands what it takes to get it done. She's taken the measures to do it. I think that's a positive for all of us.
We need an administration that will accept all forms of energy. I've stated and I've testified, we need nuclear, we need alternative energy, wind and solar, and we need hydrocarbons. We need an administration that supports all of those and the infrastructure that we need to implement all of those across the board.